Thank you for joining XROM, which is India's first AR/VR focused podcast. And today I'm delighted and honored to have with me Mr. Phil Galler, who's the co-president of Lux Machina Consulting, the company behind the real-time virtual production of The Mandalorian and many more. So Phil, really appreciate you taking time being part of the podcast and sharing your insights on virtual production. I mean, that's the topic that we're going to be talking about today. So why don't we start with a brief introduction on who you are and a little bit about Lux Machina Consulting.
Yeah, thanks, and really appreciate you having me. This is super cool. So my name's Philip Galler. I was one of the original founders of Lux Machina. We started the business in almost a decade ago now, and it was centered around using large screens like projection and LED displays to create backgrounds for movies. So before we did real-time work, we used to do we call pre-rendered work. So we put up driving plates, or we put up scenes of big vistas and skies and environments that were static or moving but didn't have a tracked camera component. And we'd use those outside windows of spaceships and aircraft and homes to create set extension basically. And we also do quite a bit of broadcast work, and so we work on award shows, and we work on corporate events, and we work in live events, and a bunch of consulting is where the name came from. We kind of cross the boundaries between technology and creative, and hope that we can empower people to tell better stories, right? And to give people the ability to use technology in a way that enables them to be, I think, more free with their narrative and free to make choices on the day.
It's more than 100 years, from your black and white to, everything is evolved. It's not just from the black and white to color to your IMAX now. Even the audio is evolved, from being silent to mono to stereo to Dolby to 5.1 to going to spatial ambisonic sound. So the journey has been super awesome. And now we are like almost going to be breaking or go beyond the 2D medium, because so far all medium has been 2D, and it's been very passive, that it's never been interactive, because we sit in front of the TV or the theater or even a mobile. It's quite passive. But with tools such as AR, VR, MR, we're going to be diving into the next spatial computing, what we're building, the Web 3.0 and the metaverse, and so we're going into an exciting space. So let's break this down, because you said you largely do consulting. You have done works across some of the best films in the world. You have done broadcast work. You've done award works. So for my audience who don't really know what virtual production is, let's break that down and make them understand. So maybe we can start from there.
We think of virtual production as just actual regular production. So for us, any element of production can have a virtual component, and a virtual component is just something digital, right? Something that comes from the CG, or an element that is a composite onto the real world. So it's a way for us as production staff and production crew and creatives to utilize sort of this, sort of like you're saying with the metaverse and Web 3.0, right? It's like, is this level of interactivity on top of the real world, and it represents a merging of the real world and the story we're trying to tell in a way that hopefully becomes more tangible, right? So a good example would be, and probably the easiest example I think, is a virtual camera, right? And a virtual camera, in essence, is this idea that we can use a normal camera to peer into our created world, right? So we go ahead and we create a bunch of virtual or digital assets, right? Just regular computer graphics. And then we're able to portray that in a normal camera setting, so that a director, a cinematographer, production designers, can peer through that camera lens and see the art that was made and where it would be represented in the real world. And it's sort of that blending of the virtual and the physical, right, that I think really is the standout feature of virtual production. It's the combination and the compositing of the real with the virtual, with the digital assets. Digital asset really at its core is just a 3D object that's made for many purposes. Some reason, some are made as previs elements, and they never go any further. Some are made as storytelling elements only, right? And they make it through into some of the screen work, but are replaced in post-production. And some digital assets are made at the very beginning of the film and carry all the way through into post-production. And so when we think about digital production and virtual production, it really scales or is on the spectrum from really pre-production all the way through to post-production. And there's these touch points of where the physical and the virtual meet across that spectrum that I think are the definition of what we think of as virtual production. It's really just the moment in time in which we use tools to combine the virtual and physical and then see both things in combination that allow us to hopefully make better decisions, right? And more creative decisions about what it is we want to be doing. And then I think, as we look at the future, right, metaverse, we see more and more of that composite becoming permanent, right? And that at some point, instead of just viewing through a VCam, right, we're viewing through holographic glasses and we're viewing through augmented reality headsets. And at some point, that merger of the physical and the virtual becomes somewhat permanent, and that sort of redefines the human experience because we can have this layer of information and digital graphics and virtual, sort of virtualization on top of the physical world. And that's sort of like the holy grail of storytelling, is that we can tell stories in any format, any way, anywhere, that are completely immersive. And that, I think, I don't remember who said the famous quote, right? But like, good technology is indistinguishable from magic, right? You shouldn't be able to tell the difference between the two. And that, right? It's that concept, right? Like at some point here, we get to a point where the art is so believable and the technology is so believable, but they also work together so seamlessly, right? That we're able to redefine the human experience with not just ourselves, but with others.
Lovely, yeah. So I think, this transition or this push towards digitization is so awesome, because it's kind of democratizing things, because I've been vested in audio production. I started in the days, when there were these spools, 4-track recorders, audio recorders, the spool machines, beta tapes, and then it graduated from there to digital audio workstation. It went to, Pro Tools, Nuendo and stuff like that. And then life became so much simpler. You didn't need a mixing board, like a 12 channel, 36 channel, 86 channel, 100 channel mixers. Right now you just need 2 outs and that's it. And you can composite all those 100 tracks out directly into 2 tracks. I think the same thing is happening with video. These offline, earlier there were these offline suits which are super expensive. Now that's becoming more and more accessible, and there are these gaming engines which is kind of democratizing how you can create content. But that one side is that you need to be a little more technical over there, because you need to understand a little bit of coding. I see like a constant tug of war, because there's this two field, because there's one side, there's your Jon Favreau and James Cameron who are really leveraging this tool, and then there's these other side of filmmakers, Christopher Nolan, Lana Wachowski, who like to go analog, and where do you think the future of filmmaking is going? Is this like the analog and digital, the physical and digital is going to go tilt more towards digital? And let's talk about maybe like 5 years, 10 years down the line, because you've been so vested in the space.
It's a really interesting discussion, but it may not matter, right? So part of the beauty, right, of filmmaking is that people get to choose how they want to make it, right? And it's this medium that can be expressed in many ways. And some people are going to lean into the digital and the virtual productions of it. Some people are going to find that they're able to tell their stories better, or to really access the emotions of the viewers in a more tangible way by doing something physical and in camera, right? And everybody's a different way of working. I think, there's the what do they do on the day, and then there's the back end of it all, right? The post-production of it all. I think there's an inevitable business that will have to come from virtualizing of digital production in post-production, virtual production in post-production, and in pre-production, right? And even in preparing practical cinematographers and director teams for doing the stuff that they're going to do in camera that's physical, can still use virtual assets in a pre-visualization way. And I think that what we'll find is that it may not be that on the day, like on the actual shooting day, people are using virtual production, but maybe they've gotten there through the use of virtual production because they want to be able to know where do they need to compose their physical set pieces, where do they need to have their physical actors, where are they going to put their physical lights. And I think what we're finding is that things like previs, tech viz, VCam work, simulcam work, that all gives us better framing for the story we want to tell. Whether or not we use them when we're in situ or not is almost immaterial, because I think we have no choice but to use those things in pre-production, largely because it's a business, right? It's got to run faster, it's got to run more efficiently. And virtual production effectively does all those things by amortizing the assets across multiple steps of production, by democratizing the process. And yes, you've got to be more technical, but I think the people who are, and I think the barrier for technology comes down over time. Just even generationally, people, younger generations generally have more experience of these things, so they're born into it. So I think long term we get to that level, but I think it doesn't need to actually change necessarily what's tangibly done during a shooting day, right? It can still be that people pick up a film camera, like a real film camera, and actually go out and shoot real film to make the story that they want to make, and that's the way they feel like it has to be communicated. And so in my mind, it's less of a tug of war between like tape versus digital, which was about the technology of the shooting work, and it's more about how do we use this technology to enable people to make the thing they want to make, even if they're not going to use it while they're actively making it, but they're doing it in the run-up and the post part of it. That's how I view it anyways.
Fair enough, completely. So you have been vested in the space, you've done some of the biggest films in the world. Why don't you share some of the experiences of the content that you have built, and how you have leveraged these tools, and talk to us about volume production, moving from green screen to LED also.
So our first real LED, so one of our first big, what I'll call large canvas production was Oblivion, and it was this movie with Tom Cruise about it came out a decade ago, a little over a decade ago now. Or we worked on it a decade ago, and it was really cool. It was a good use of large scale projection technology. So traditional projector technology. It wasn't laser projectors. It was sort of old DLP projectors from Barco, and it was a really good use case of a set that needed a solution that was going to be more affordable, right? So this was actually driven largely by affordability. The show had something like 1,600 VFX shots it needed to have done, and we were able to carve out about 800 of them, which cut the number of VFX shots in half for the movie by using projection technology. And a lot of the work that was going to be done was reflections, and there was a lot of water on the set, and there was a lot of glass and chrome and all this stuff. It was really difficult to relight and paint. And so by using projection, we were able to get to a point where we could avoid having to do a lot of that work in post. And that sort of set off this, it was the genesis of Lux, but it was also this idea that there was probably a better way to do production that utilized technology to maybe reduce the workload of post, but also give people back, sort of like you're saying, this tug of war, but sort of give people back the ability to make decisions in situ about what they were doing. And that was the idea of moving away from green screen, right? Is that like, okay, we're not just looking at a giant void of green, but it's what the other option for the show was. And that would have been extremely expensive to fix in post because of the chrome and the water and all this stuff. But more importantly, it wasn't, it didn't give anyone the information they needed, right? Like no one knew where the clouds were, no one knew where the sun was, no one knew where the moon was. There were some spaceships, there was some orbital destruction stuff that was out in the distance, and the actors needed to respond to that, right? And so for this, the genesis of this storytelling and the need to help people tell their stories better was that we realized is that the actors actually were the ones who benefited the most from this, right? There's this idea that it's about the backgrounds and it's about the foregrounds and it's about the lighting and the reflections and all this stuff. And everybody's got their own sort of idea of what is the most important. For us, it was the fact that we were seeing that the actors for the first time felt like they were actually in a place. And for a decade, they've been standing in green, right? They've been standing in green and blue. And they were able to do really, really impressive things in green or blue environments. But it was a lack of depth and emotion in their performances, because even though they were really convincing, we still didn't believe it as an audience because they weren't really responding to anything as actors, right? So that was sort of the start for us, and then that was projection, and then in 2012 or 13 we worked on a movie called Tomorrowland, which was a Disney project, and that's where we utilized some of the first fanless LEDs. Up to that point, a lot of the problem with LED had been that LED walls had large fans in them, so they were very noisy, heat sinks and stuff like that. And so we used a fanless LED, and it was an 11 millimeter LED, so really low resolution for now, anyways. And that worked really well. It was a really, really good opportunity to explore some really interesting technologies, such as spherical reprojection onto LED services, which is one of the first times that had been done for anything, and one of the first times, I think the first time it had ever been done for a movie. And we realized that we could actually start to blend visual effects technologies and playback technologies from broadcast shows. In visual effects, we're used to using HDRIs, right, to relight stuff all the time. And these usually come as, 360-degree panospheres in some fashion, right? And so we're actually able to use those and reproject them into static LED walls, right? And so this is sort of this beginning of this idea that we could take stuff that was in the VFX pipeline already and reuse it. And so that got us to a place where we were starting to do that a lot, right? And then it got into, well, let's do this for vehicles. Like, why aren't we just doing this for vehicles, right? At this point, we've got this to the point where only people with a couple $1 million can spend, a couple $1 million on lighting gags, right? And that's what it had been. And then it was around the House of Cards era with Dave Fincher, where we started designing systems for vehicles specifically. And at first it was just reflections. And then it became good enough technologically that we were able to do out car windows, believable. First it was projection out car windows, then it was LED out car windows. And that got us to about 2015, 2016, where you see the likes of Gravity, you see the likes of Orient Express, you see the likes of First Man, Solo, Rogue One, all at this sort of increasing cadence. And you see this cadence goes hand in hand with the, I think, the increase in quality of technology, but also the sort of like this podcast, right? The education, the outreach, right? The ability to bring people into the technology. And it's why these forums are so important for everybody, is that lowering that bar to accessibility and lowering the bar of difficulty and lowering the bar of understanding means that more people can engage with the technology. And ultimately, that's actually what all volume production is about, right? It's about giving people back the idea that they can control something. They can do it in real time and hopefully in a way that's natural to them. So we're reducing the barrier of entry. We're reducing the barrier of complexity, and we're giving people back control from what they had in the 80s, right? Before blue screen and green screen, the ability to actually do the work that they wanted to do, which is go out into these fantastical environments and make really cool decisions. And so from a volume production point of view, as we get into Mandalorian, what you see is actually a bit of a misconception. I think there's this perceived notion that the solution was intended to solve for backgrounds, right? We get these beautiful backgrounds in camera. That was part of it. But a lot of it was also reflections and lighting, right? And it's so hard to redo really, really beautiful lighting and really, really beautiful reflections. They're really, really difficult to do in visual effects, right? And they're costly. There's only a handful of people in the world that do it at the highest levels. It requires many layers of visual effects production technology, and it's difficult, right? And it's an art form, right? And I think this was the opportunity to give, not remove the art form from the visual effects lighters' hands, but to give the art form back to the people who were already making a lot of the lighting decisions, which was the cinematographers, right? They were already standing in front of sets going, add this light here, put a flag here, put some diffusion here, put gel here, and they were really responsible for crafting that, right? That lighting. And this was giving them another tool to do that. And I think for us, that's what we realized, is that volume production, I think right now everybody looks at it and goes, oh, it can be used for everything. But it's really not, right? It should be the right tool for the right job. There's a lot of times where it doesn't work right, or it doesn't work the way it needs to. And we should be looking at it as another tool to use in telling the story that we want to tell. I think oftentimes when you think you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? And a lot of production is treated that way. And fortunately, it's really difficult to do that with volumes, because people, and this is part of the education process for everybody, is it takes a lot of time to get into a volume in a prepared way, in that you've got to do pre-production, you've got to do your pre-vis, you've got to build all your assets ahead of time, you've got to have an understanding of what it's like to go into that location. And that's how we treat it very much. We treat all these sets like they're locations, right? We tell people when you're going into a space, pretend like you're going into a redwood forest, right? You wouldn't show up in the redwood forest on the day, not have done any scouts, and decide that you're going to move all the trees around. Just like we'd all get in trouble, right? We'd all get fired. We showed up in the day, told the UPM, the director, oh, we need to come back in a couple of weeks. We've got to move all these trees around, right? And so what we like to do is say, no, like do the tech scouts ahead of time, but do them virtually, right? Or there's other ways to do them if you don't want to engage with them virtually, like use an artist to navigate those environments with you. Think about what you would do in the real world, frame things up through a camera, look through that camera and understand what you're going to get on the other side, so that as you're using the tool, you're making decisions about two things. What you don't need control of, which is such an important element of it, is like, what am I not going to want to touch? What do I want to lock in right now? Because like you would make that decision about the real outdoors. You would go to the redwood forest and go, okay, half these trees don't need to move, but I really am going to need to move this on the day. Like, let's figure out how to do that. And that's the conversation we should be having. It's like, okay, how do we move this tree virtually on the day? How do we change the sunlight in a way that gets me to magic hour? Or how do we add that second sun, because this world has a second sun in it, and we need to think about how it affects the shadows on all these trees. And those are the conversations I think when we talk about volume production, they're so important that people kind of gloss over, and they think about the technology a lot, right? They think about the LED and what kind of camera tracking and what kind of Unreal Engine system is it. And ultimately, like, that stuff's important, but it should melt away in light of being able to engage in a way with the volume itself that is a tool and not a means to just using cool technology. And actually, there's you asked about some of our experiences. One of the experiences I'll share is we just had a film which I actually shot on real film, generating Eddie Alcazar, who just showed his piece off, a Vandal, at Cannes, and it did really well at Cannes. And what was really interesting about it is that we actually shot it in a really small LED volume, actually the one in our office where we did the SIGGRAPH demo, so 30 feet across and like 10 feet high, right, tiny. And we actually used a combination of miniatures and real sized actors combined with miniature environments to shoot against LED. And it was really, really convincing, because we were in a position where all of a sudden we're blending these really, really interesting techniques of filmmaking, right? First off, we're on film, which is a rarity these days, on real film, but we're using miniatures. And then we're also using real life actors, and we're combining the two in a really interesting way. And I think that piece is a great example of how to utilize the tools you want to make the film you want, without letting the technology get in the way of doing it.
You opened up so many interesting things. No matter what technology or tool that you have, the homework never goes out. You need to, be sure about it, run through all this thing, and then go and do it. And yes, I guess this is in such a nascent stage. I think everybody is kind of figuring out the grammar of where this is going to go, and I think maybe in the next, and yes, it's got so many problems. You mentioned that LED panels earlier used to be quite noisy, and right now it's so very expensive, to have them. So eventually, I guess maybe like how these independent filmmakers are able to leverage just a green cloth and shoot content which is like world standard, with like even normal cameras. I think maybe technology is doing that. It's giving you the opportunity for those really visionary, creative and out there content creators the tool to go ahead and create content without being bounded, because eventually, I guess, once this is accessible and available for everyone, I think the content creation would be so awesome. Because even right now, at least from my perspective, I'm seeing that post-COVID, your theaters are not so relevant. I'm not saying that it's going to go out, but I feel that people are going to go out and see like really big movies. They'll go to theater because it's a great way to, meet up, socialize. But, people are moving to OTT platforms, and digital content. So there's this. And besides that, I think content creators, there was these earlier you need huge cameras and editing softwares, audio editing softwares. But right now I think you can do it in basic thing, as long as you are really good. Now there are some fantastic content creators who are pushing the boundary of short form content on your TikTok and Instagram, and it's it blows your mind that there are these amazing quality content creators out there who are like really pushing the boundary. Now imagine if they have this tool, what the content is going to look like. And imagine if there is artificial intelligence, where it's going to help you, and there's virtual reality. So I am like an excited kid of what the future of content is going to look like. Would you like to talk about some, since you have a consulting play, would you like to talk about some clients who have like really pushed you to the boundaries, and pushed you to do something which you thought was impossible? But
Yeah, absolutely. And what I'll say also is, I completely agree with you. Right? Is I look at this as, we saw when people started to get camera phones, right? They started to make content in new ways, and all of a sudden there was a flood of content, right? And there was too much content at first because everyone's got a phone and is taking videos of every stupid thing, right? But eventually we got down to a bunch of really, really extremely well curated, and sure, there's still a lot of nonsense out there, but there's a lot of really, really talented people actually using these devices to make really, really impactful content, right? Especially not only in the independent scene, but on the on really emotional topics like economic disparity and abuse and mental health. And I think these have become really, really important narratives of our lifetime, right? We see war-torn countries where a decade and 20 years ago we wouldn't be able to hear stories right from the ground, and now we're able to actually, in many cases, see what's happening and reach out and bridge, I think, gaps with communities that we never would have interacted with, 20 or 30 years ago. And I think for me, that's super important, is that we've given, through technology and hopefully through this technology as well, access to people who not only felt like they couldn't tell the story they wanted to tell before, but I think it's also important that there are people who couldn't tell stories at all before and now are able to tell stories, and we've given them a voice. And I think that's super important to what everyone's trying to achieve, right? It's just the ability to have agency, the ability to have voice. So that's, just listening to you talk, I totally echo what you say. So yeah, with regards to clients who push us really far, first and foremost, Industrial Light and Magic, who's been a great partner over the years. They've pushed the envelope of this technology in a way that I think has been really exciting for us, and has pushed us to keep up in many cases, right? As an independent, smaller studio, it's difficult to compete with large VFX houses who have the, serious capital behind them. But it's meant that we have to be a little bit different. We have to be a little more agile. We have to be a little more ingenious about how we come up with our systems and how we staff our shows. And I think their push at technology has enabled our business to push at our agility and our ability to pivot. And I think that's something that's super important in the modern era of business, right? Is the ability to change direction very quickly. On a show with Apple right now, and we're doing stuff that if you had asked me 2 or 3 years ago if certainly we as a business would be able to do, I would have told you there's no way. And now I'm 6 months into a show going, man, this is really cool. And like, it works, right? Like, it's worked pretty much every single day for 6 months. And I think we've had 1 day of downtime in that 6 months, which, when you think about, production across the board, shooting 12 hours a day. And we've gotten to a point where the systems are reliable enough, the hardware is good enough, the software is good enough that we're able to really do some really, really amazing stuff. And in we're shooting on multiple volumes at once concurrently with multiple teams with different levels of goals that we're trying to achieve. And that's what's really fascinating to me, is that there's a fluidity between the volumes. That's for one show. Fluidity between the volumes that has enabled us to go from photorealism just to previs to we're going to do some look dev, and we're going to do some photogrammetry, and we're going to do it all in the volumes. And it's given production, I think, a vast array of tools. And a lot of the show is based in the volumes because of the work that it involves. The studio has really pushed, really given us the trust, really trusted us with the ability to execute. I think that's what it takes, right? It just takes trust and partnership. And I think in this case, like, the trust has been really really good. Like we trusted that, they were going to have a great show and a good team of directors, of course, if they did. And they trusted us to execute this really complex technological thing and hopefully remove the burden of technology from the show, which I'd like to think that we've done. I also think the other group that's pushing us is Netflix. Netflix is such a good proponent of all this stuff, man. They, from their N labs, which are interactive lab spaces where people get to interface with technology in a way that helps them interface tangibly with things like VCam and augmented reality and LED, and in a small space that's like a safe space almost, right? Like we don't have to worry about, oh, they spent $1 million on something that doesn't work, right? And it's, again, that education and that outreach is so important. I think Netflix is, in many ways, they push the boundaries of technology, but not because they do it themselves, but because they enable their filmmakers to do it. And I think when you're enabling the storytellers and giving the storytellers the tools and removing their stress, like you put the insurance policy in place that allows them to do the work that they want to do and let them know it's okay to occasionally fail, which like is how we all got here. Like we've all failed 1,000,000 times, right? I fail regularly, and like you just got to learn from that. And I think Netflix has really enabled their storytellers to take risks, but they've also pushed in the thing that is so important, is education and community outreach, and that's really where I think they're pushing boundaries. Is like, in my mind, they're the first studio that's really actively gone out and done panels about how to do education, actively had education in-house, actively had education for their filmmakers externally and internally. And I think that's a huge part of pushing the boundaries, is like getting people familiar with the fact that there's new things out there that they can try to do.
I had the opportunity to interview Vicky Dobbs on the show, and yeah, I mean, there's so many exciting things happening. I mean, it's not just the big production houses, but the entire, the content creators, even the individual content creators, have an opportunity because of this the technology. There's something called as NFTs, and eventually you'll be able to kind of monetize your content. So it's an exciting space that we are getting into. You also have done broadcast, for MTV Awards, Golden Globe Awards, and stuff like that. Where do you think the events are going? There is this. The reason I ask this is because besides your physical events, there's this metaverse happening, and there's virtual event because of COVID. There was on Fortnite. I mean, Travis performed with millions of audience. Where is it going? What do you think the future of events is going to look like?
Yeah, it's such a fascinating topic right now, isn't it? Right? Is where does this all head? So there's two things, right? One is, I think AI ML is the future, right? Like there's no version of the future where we're not powered by machine learning and some artificial intelligence of some kind, right? Like experiences, the technology behind experiences, the creative behind experiences will be completely driven by the use of machine learning algorithms in the next 10 years. That's truly my belief. I'm a firm believer that we're actually in a cadence in the visual effects industry, right? You see everything being done with projection in the 50s and 60s, and then you see the rise of CG and computer graphics, right? And then you see the rise of LED because we get significantly better looking environments. And I think what we actually see in the next 5 years, maybe it's the 10 years, is the next roller coaster, right? Is actually a reduction in the use of LED, and it's a massive increase in the use of machine learning algorithms to actually create CG much more quickly and actually do the lighting properly, right? And that's the biggest thing, right? There's this uncanny valley that we talk about, right? It's people's faces. So there's also this uncanny valley it's sort of we talk about internally, which is the uncanny valley of lighting, right? And when you're trying to have a conversation with someone through what I think is the next human experience, which is sort of this holographic experience, right? Where whether it's light field displays or it's some other type of holographic perception, if you're talking to someone and you believe that they're in an environment that you also know, if the lighting doesn't look right, you don't believe what you're seeing, right? And I think that what we get to is a point where machine learning understands that and understands the facets of human communication in a way that can be transmitted more easily than what we're currently doing, which is, trying to stream in lots of data about people across the internet, and that's really difficult. You see people like Paul Debevec, right, and the work he's done at Google before he went to Netflix with regards to some of the light field work and communicating long distances, and the ability to condense that information into something that's transferable over a network is I think is a hugely crucial element of the future. But I also believe with that becomes the alternate, which is it's all virtual and we just all have avatars, right? The metaverse of it all. But to get to the metaverse, and that I believe is photoreal, and they're not even photoreal. Like the photorealism almost doesn't matter. What matters is that we believe it. Whether it's photoreal or not, we just have to believe it. And this is a metric that we use all the time on set. Like walk up to a camera, monitor, and like if I can look at the monitor and I can believe it, I'll walk away. If I look at the monitor and I go, I don't believe this, it needs to get fixed, right? And that's how people are going to view it at home. And sure, we're probably more perceptive than most because like we spend all of our time collectively, right, looking at monitors. But I think the idea is that in the metaverse, right, we will see the rise of AI ML as a solution for creating content more efficiently and more effectively, but also better content, more realistic content, more believable content. And we'll see this dip, right? The LED stuff's going to be around for 5 years. It's going to be huge, and maybe 10 years. And at some point, the next cadence is definitely AI ML taking over. And simply because like it'll be able to do it faster and more efficiently, but also potentially be able to do it in real time in front of you, right? Right now, part of the challenge with LED walls, right, is we have to have them. Right? If we could go out into the environment and we could point a camera at a subject and in an extremely low latency way, a machine learning algorithm could remove the background, digitally relight that person with the environment that we've already built.
How cool would that be?
That would be really cool, right? And I think that, to me, that's where we're headed. Like it's inevitable, and it's just a matter of time, right? And I think for me, this is the ethos, right? Exactly of like where we're going, right? And that's what we're looking at. And then the next hill we see, right, is we see that happening, right? And then we see sort of like the tug of war you asked about earlier. We see this cadence of people then wanting to go back to actually doing stuff tangibly, right? So we see as light field displays actually taking over from LED wall about 15 years from now, 20 years from now, or people can afford them and the prices come down. So we see light field displays taking over from or being combined with AI ML, right? The content being made through machine learning and being displayed holographically on light field displays. And then we're not worried about how many cameras do we track? What's the limitation of the number of cameras? What's the limitation of the number of people? What are the artifacts we see? It's just this, hopefully, sort of holy grail of display technology, right? In that we are able to see any perspective and believe any perspective. And I think that is the next probably 15 to 20 years of the visual effects industry. But I think the metaverse is somewhere intertwined between all those things, right? It's the metaverse is the light field display, right? It's the belief that we can all stand in one place and see different perspectives of something, combined with the machine learning that happens over the next 10 to 15 years that enables us to look at something and believe that it's real, even when it's not. And of course, a lot of this has two sides, right? There's the dystopian future of advertising where we're got supplanted advertising that's totally believable. We can't discern between reality and advertising, which is definitely inevitable as well. But part of this is also the ability to talk to our grandparents and communicate with them from 10,000 miles away, or I mean, even further, like what happens when there are people on other planets and we want to be able to communicate with them? Like we have to have a means to do that, and I know it seems, we're talking about the metaverse, we're talking about other planets, and it seems like a crazy thing, but like, it's not anymore. Like it was, right? It was 10, 15 years ago. Like in 20 years, like we're going to have people on other planets we're going to want to communicate with, and we're going to want to communicate with them in a seamless way that's believable. And we're going to need to do it in a way that's across space and across time. Right. And in a way that I think machine learning enables us to do, and holographic displays enable us to do, in the way that we can walk up to those displays or be immersed in those environments and go, yeah, I believe this. And that, to me, that's what the human experience is about not just how do we talk to people here and now, but how do we talk to people who are so far away that we can't pick up the phone or that we can't actually get on a plane and go see them. And that, to me, is where, I don't know if Facebook's thinking that far in the future, Meta's thinking that far in the future, but like, that's where this is heading, right? Like the inevitable is that there will be people or other species, right, that we need to communicate with that are at millions of miles away. And the only way to do it is to, right now, focus on how to sell believability in a user's experience with another user who isn't really there. And that, for me, is what the metaverse is about.
Lovely. Phil, so, I mean, thank you for being so open, because, there's a lot of time, I guess, people hold back because, when you talk out about the far out future, you go into the woo-woo crazy zones. So normally people kind of avoid that. But yes, I guess, we need to be open and start tinkering around and laying those building blocks and being so brave enough and having a foresight that what you are doing today is going to be building the future. So yes, super exciting space. Bollywood, it's like one of the biggest biggest film production in the world. We produce a whole lot of films. Is there any plans for Lux Machina Consulting to have some engagement here in Bollywood, and do share some light maybe to the listeners that how maybe Lux Machina Consulting can enable or Bollywood filmmaking over here?
Yeah, so absolutely. We're actually actively looking for people to partner with on joint ventures around the world, and we'd love to find a partner who wants to open a considerable size stage in India, especially in your in a region, Mumbai or wherever, in a region that helps Bollywood really, because we think that we can do a couple different things. We think that we come from a place where we can enable storytellers. We also think we can lower the barrier of entry for the technology, and so yeah, we are actually actively looking for a partner. So if there's anyone out there who's listening who's interested, feel free to email me. It's pgaller@luxmc.com. And we'd love to have a conversation about how to partner to build a stage of some size, and it could be just a simple process car stage. It could be at LED volume. We really want to find a way to do this, because we think that honestly, Bollywood's an untapped market for us. So there's a business opportunity, and that's important for the growth of obviously what we're doing. But I think more importantly, we think that there's to our earlier discussion, right? There's a whole generation of storytellers who can tell new stories, and we want to enable them to have access to the technology. And whether it's green screen and virtual cameras or LED or projection, it's almost immaterial. It's just like, let's just get the technology moving. And once the technology is moving, that train is going, and people will get on it, and they'll get off it sometimes, and that's okay. But if they can't even get on the train, we can never help them get closer to their destination or telling the story they want to tell. I would love to partner with anybody who wants to find a way to build a studio and how we can enable that work to get done. We'd love to do that.
Technology is a double-edged sword. It's got so much goods and it's got a few bads, and the goods have always been loaded, because if not for technology, I don't think we would be sitting over here or even having this conversation, because it has enabled the world to in each and every space, from education to healthcare to work and so on and so forth. We are going into a world where virtual reality is becoming more and more realistic, and then add to it, there'll be layers such as haptic feedback, which is going to enable us to touch feel the virtual world. You mentioned light field, we'll have volumetric videos, and there's artificial intelligence, which is going to create interactive storytelling. Then there is obviously that when people who watch Black Mirror, they always look at the dark side, but there's so much of good things which storytelling can enable. Go all out, maybe like 10 years into the future. Your prediction, what the future of storytelling is going to look like, the good and the bad.
Let me start with the bad. So I think the future of storytelling, I think, is really the dynamic placement of advertising inside people's, whether it's directly in their heads or it's through augmented reality devices, AR glasses, whatever you want to call it. Or even in the internet, right? In all of our viewing experiences will be the planting of ads that are closer than ever to being so specifically targeted to the individual user that they're indiscernible from reality. And I think that's where we're inevitably headed. And I think it's it's the Blade Runner of it all a little bit, right? And I do think that's where we're headed. Not think, like, that's where we're headed for sure. Part of it's an inevitability is that advertising is one of the biggest economic machines in the world, right? And the economic machines need to exist for a variety of reasons, and just one of them is advertising. And I think so. For me, that's sort of the downside of this is the closer we become to being seamless with the technology, the closer we become to being seamless with the advertising, which is a little bit scary. And I think that's sort of the downside. But I think the upside is actually the silver lining of that. It means that we have hyper-personalized experiences on the good side, right? Hyper-personalized stories, choose your own adventures that aren't just choose your own adventures where I'm choosing an adventure from 5 options, but the adventures have been, the choices, the paths, right, have been dynamically generated based on me, myself, and I'm able to have an experience that isn't like I've chosen A, B, C, or D. It's like I've chosen an A, B, C, or D that are completely different and made on the spot based on the emotional state that I'm in, based on where I am, based on who I'm with, who's around me, what other people are involved in the engaging experience that I'm having, that enable us to have completely unique experiences. And I kind of think of it as a um, Dungeons and Dragons, right? Like it's this really weird throwback here. But like Dungeons and Dragons is this thing where like you've got and I never played it, but like I understand like the concept at least is a game master, right? Who is helping to tell a story for a set of individuals, and no two stories is alike, right? They play, I think, on a board, and it's a dice-based game, obviously. Preaching to the choir, I imagine a lot of people know what Dungeons and Dragons is, right? But in my mind, it's this idea of it's the modernization of that. It's the technologization of that, not a word, but like the bring that into the future, right? Is this idea that storytellers are able to dictate that story so responsively to what we're doing that they're able to reach directly into the moment in time in which we're interacting with their story and change something, right? So that I can be having an experience and someone is saying, oh, you're not actually in that forest anymore. Maybe your neighbor's in that forest and he or she's having that experience, but you're actually on a space station because you've been really fascinated about space stuff recently. We think that's going to evoke a more emotional response with the scary thing that's about to happen, right? And I think it's that dungeon master, the game master of it all, right, that enables us to tell super responsive stories that are tweakable in the moment, and that's something that we just don't have right now. Just not something that we've done. I think that's a huge part of what machine learning enables us to do, right? We're able to maybe give it a set of guidelines and then feed it with demographic data about a user, and that enables it to help craft a story and decide when to make decisions about when to change the story. And right now we use a lot of machine learning to make decisions about how to do things about stories that are already told instead of about how to tell stories. And I think that's where I see the future is like we get into that level of narrative is super, super hyper specific to the individual user, down to like emotional state and stuff like that.
Lovely, lovely. How cool is that? Phil, thank you for sharing your insight and being part of the podcast. I mean, really appreciate you doing this. And to my listeners, if you like what you see in here, then please press the subscribe button. Until next time, see you guys. Bye-bye. Thank you. Thank you. Lovely.
Thank you so much for having me.